On April 26, another one of the publicity-seeking militants was killed by sniper fire. His name was Buddy Lamont. Buddy was a Vietnam vet who had helped construct the bunkers at Wounded Knee. He seemed to fear the worst and said, "If anything happens, just bury me at Wounded Knee." Instead, his body was seized by the BIA, who would not release his body to his poverty-stricken family until they came up with $1,800. On May 4th, an offer was made that the occupiers if the occupiers surrendered, 4 or 5 White House representatives would come to Pine Ridge and discuss the 1868 treaty with the chiefs, and that corruption on Pine Ridge would be investigated. On May 5th, the occupiers agreed to the government's offer, and on May 9th, the Indians who hadn't already fled Wounded Knee were arrested. On May 17th, the promised White House delegation met with Chief Foolscrow and several hundred other Indians. The delegation had no authority, and after some empty discussion, the delegation returned to Washington saying that they would respond in 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, the hopeful Sioux Indians gathered once more to hear from the White House reps. But no one from the White House bothered to show up. Instead, they were presented with a letter which simply repeated that the days of treaty-making with Indians had ended with the Congressional Act of 1871. Senator McGovern once again chimed in on the situation, saying that it was ridiculous to talk about the Treaty of 1868 being carried out. Of course, he made no mention of the vacation property which he owned in the Black Hills. Corruption was never investigated. The demands of the Wounded Knee occupiers were not met. However, Dennis Banks would say the following about the experience. Before A.I.M, our young people lived in despair. They drank themselves to death, they were ashamed to be Indians, some committed suicide. At Wounded Knee, they became warriors again and began to feel good about themselves. They began to be good about being Sioux, Cheyenne, or Ojibwe. They put on their red face paint, let their hair grow long, and proudly wore their ribbon shirts. Under fire, they learned to respect themselves once more. And after almost 100 years, they were ghost dancing again. In July and August of 1973, A.I.M held its national convention, at which Banks was elected as the national director, and Carter Camp and John Trudell were elected as co-chairs. A.I.M also asserted that it would engage in a campaign to repeal the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and dismantle the government-sponsored tribal councils and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In September of that year, indictments began to be served for the Wounded Knee incident. Dennis Banks and Russell Means were among the first to be tried. Longtime A.I.M member Pedro Bissonette, who had an intimate knowledge of the corruption of the Dick Wilson regime, was intended to testify for the defense of Banks and Means. But on October 17, 1973, he was shot point blank in the chest with a shotgun by a Bureau of Indian Affairs officer. Despite this tragic setback, Banks and Means were acquitted, setting a precedent for the rest of the Wounded Knee tribes. Meanwhile, mining corporations had begun exploratory drilling for uranium in the Black Hills. And Dennis Banks was making statements that A.I.M was going to shift its attention to the prevention of exploitation of resources on Indian lands. In May of 1975, William Janklow became the new Attorney General of South Dakota. Janklow described himself as an Indian fighter in the tradition of Custer. This was a fairly apt description. Janklow had been leading the police effort against A.I.M and was the one behind jailing Sarah Badhart Bull for protesting the state's refusal to prosecute her son's murder. In 1967, Janklow had raped a 15-year-old girl named Jancita Eagledeer, of whom he was the legal guardian. He was never charged with the offense, but Jancita's stepmother, Delphine Eagledeer, swore that she would prove he had raped Jancita. She never did. Jancita, shamed by the whole incident, ran away. Delphine was beaten to death by Bureau of Indian Affairs police. Together, Dick Wilson and Janklow vowed to stamp out A.I.M. Thus began the Pine Ridge Reign of Terror. The FBI, not to be outdone, began infiltrating A.I.M with informants, one of which was Bill Durham, Dennis Banks' bodyguard. Durham orchestrated a campaign deliberately designed to backfire at A.I.M, where they would try to bring out the Janklow rape case. Using his FBI contacts, Durham tracked down Jancita Eagledeer. Of course, there was no way to prove Jancita's case so many years down the road, and A.I.M came away from the event looking a little bit silly. Durham and another informant named Blue Dove were also behind a plot to get 2 drunken, low-level A.I.M members in California to participate in a murder. The event generated massive negative publicity, and Bill Durham took it upon himself to act as the media spokesperson for the fiasco, of course making matters much worse for A.I.M. Anna Mae Aquash was now head of the West Coast chapter of A.I.M. and worked with Bill Durham along with young actress and Native American Alaskan Neelock Butler. Anna Mae was among the first to suspect that Bill Durham was an informant and led to his being ousted by the A.I.M. leadership. Bill Durham fled and abducted Jensita Eagle Deer, who was later found murdered. Back on Pine Ridge, the reign of terror was in full swing. In the year 1975, Pine Ridge had the highest crime rate in the United States and was considered the murder capital of the U.S. The Goon Squad drove around terrorizing traditionals and suspected A.I.M. sympathizers, shooting into houses full of people, often killing children and the elderly. It got to the point where no one on the reservation went out unarmed. In February 1975, Leonard Peltier was in the Southwest assisting John Trudell and Navajo A.I.M. leader Larry Anderson in an occupation of an electronics plant on a reservation that had been laying off female workers for attempting to unionize. Dennis Banks issued a call for A.I.M. warriors to come to Pine Ridge to protect the traditionals. Peltier, Anna Mae, Neelock Butler, Dino Butler, Bob Robideau, and 3 young Navajos answered the call and returned to Pine Ridge. At Pine Ridge, they set up camp at the residence of the Jumping Bull family in the town of Oglala. In addition to offering protection, Peltier's group planted community gardens, chopped firewood for the elderly, repaired buildings, and provided counseling for alcoholics. Peltier was a strong advocate for sobriety and forbade alcohol and drug use within his group. All of the group's gear, food, cars, and guns, was owned collectively. On June 8, 1975, Russell Means was shot in the back by a BIA agent. The bullet pierced his kidney, but he survived. John Trudell, fearing that A.I.M. was being targeted for obliteration, stated that A.I.M. warriors are to shoot back when fired at, even if it was a law enforcement agent. This was the state of affairs when 2 unmarked cars roared onto the Jumping Bull residence, guns blazing, on June 26, 1975. A firefight ensued. The A.I.M. members, along with the young Navajo boys, charged up a hill overlooking the location of the 2 cars, where 2 men were firing their pistols. During the firefight, 2 backup cars came speeding up towards the camp. At 200 yards, one of the boys managed to shoot out one of their tires, sending the backup into panicked retreat. Eventually, the men by the cars were shot down and then executed by someone at close range. It soon became clear that these invaders were FBI agents Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams. In Peltier's words, we each knew that stunned and vacant look in the other's eyes, what that vacant look in the other's eyes meant. If those agents were dead, we, those Indians of us at the Jumping Bull property that day, whether man, woman, or child, were as good as dead. The response of the FBI, police, and goons was suspiciously fast, and the hills around the ranch were suddenly swarming with hundreds of them, as if this was somehow a planned raid. Peltier, Robideau, Neelock, Dino, and the rest grabbed the fallen agents' weapons and fled, knowing that the odds of them surviving were low, whether they stayed and surrendered or not. In the first moments of flight, a 20-year-old member of A.I.M. named Joe Stunts took a rearguard position and was shot through the forehead by a sniper rifle. The rest of the group sprinted south, while the air around them sang with automatic rifle fire. They stopped for a moment in a gully, and Peltier gathered everyone around for a prayer to the Great Spirit, Wakantanka. As he finished, an eagle flew directly above them and landed on a nearby tree, then flew off. They took this as a sign and followed the eagle. The feds and goons were hot on their trail, the whole time peppering their tracks with machine gun rounds. The group ran at a frantic pace, Neelock barefoot over prairie cactus. Miraculously, they escaped and found refuge at a secluded home of an old man named Noah Wounded. From here on out, they walked at nights across the prairies. Incidentally, the day before the shootout, Dick Wilson signed over 1/8 of the Pine Ridge Reservation to the federal government. The area was rich in uranium deposits, and uranium mining has since contaminated the Lakota's water supply so badly that the Lakotas now experience a rate of spontaneous abortion 7 times the national average. Eventually, Peltier escaped to Canada, and a massive manhunt began. Peltier was now on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Dino Butler was the first to be arrested when they found Agent Williams' handgun in a car near where he was staying. Bob Robideau was arrested in Wichita when the car he was in exploded. Among the debris was Agent Kohler's revolver and a burned-out AR-15 assault rifle. Robideau and Butler were tried for aiding and abetting the murder of Williams and Kohler. Their plea was that although they did fire on the agents, they did so in self-defense. Their case was convincing enough that the jury found them innocent. The FBI was irate, but had learned their lesson and would handle Peltier's trial much differently. Peltier was arrested by Canadian police, but was fighting extradition until a woman named Myrtle Poorbear, whom Peltier had never met, claiming to be his girlfriend and the mother of his child, signed an affidavit saying that she was at the Jumping Bull residence and saw Peltier execute Williams and Kohler. This was a complete contradiction of an earlier statement she had made, and there was absolutely no fingerprint evidence of Myrtle Poorbear having been at the Jumping Bull residence. But the FBI had pulled off the gloves on this one and had threatened Myrtle Poorbear with her life and the life of her child if she did not sign the affidavit.